The war in Ukraine has entered its 925th day. As the death toll has increased to an estimated 500,000, furious fighting between the two sides continues.
With our drones and missiles, we can accomplish part of the missions. But true peace, a real end to this war, is a complex task.
One of the less discussed consequences of the war, grain and the global food supply chain. Last year, Russia decided not to continue with the Black Sea Grain Initiative as an expression of continued hostilities with Ukraine. It halted access to grain shipping routes which passed through territory it now claims.
Ukraine was supplied about 10% of the world's wheat exports. Russia supplies another 20%. So I think there was a lot of concern initially when the war first broke out that both Ukraine and Russian grain would be affected.
So, what exactly is the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and how is it entangled with the war in Ukraine? The initiative was negotiated in July 2022 between Turkey, the UN, and Russia to ensure that Ukraine, called one of the breadbaskets of the world, could trade its grain through its southern ports via the Bosphorus, a strait in Turkey. Turkey was seen as an appropriate negotiator for the bill given Erdogan's proximity to Putin and the Montreux Agreement. Under the agreement, Turkey has the right to close the straits to all warships in times of war while permitting free passage to merchants.
That this would happen. And now, it's unfolding largely as we predicted.
Russia decided not to continue with the initiative, announcing that it would attack any ships seen to be transporting grain moving through the waters under its control. The international community reacted strongly to the decision. They claimed Russia was effectively enabling hunger in the poorest parts of the world, given Ukraine's deep involvement in global food security. But what effect has the revocation of the deal really had on the global food supply chain?
Well, I think that the agricultural sector has been hit hard by the war. I think there's no question, even though they've been able to export, the costs of export have been high. And that means that their producers have received a lot less for their grain than other producers in other areas of the world.
Despite the de facto blockade on the Black Sea, the prices of grain have been on a steady global decline. To bypass the blockade, Ukraine has been using a different trade route for exports, known as the Ukrainian Corridor. This route avoids confrontations with Russian naval forces. The ships instead stay close to the westernmost part of the Black Sea, along the coasts of Bulgaria and Georgia, NATO allies of Ukraine. The shallow waters here also mean that Russian submarines no longer present a threat to the Ukrainian ships. However, this corridor is so narrow that it limits the number of ships that can pass through, affecting the amount of grain that can be transported. Experts remain divided over whether Ukrainian wheat production has reached pre-war levels of grain production. While US policymakers have commended Ukraine's recent boom in export, experts at the CSIS suggest that there needs to be a nuanced analysis to understand what is going on. The war has contaminated an estimated 2.8 million hectares of Ukrainian land and destroyed key ports used to transport grains. Ukraine's future exports are expected to decline from current levels.
They will, I think the next 12 months they'll be exporting less just because they have less supplies to export. The eastern part of the country is occupied, and so they haven't, that's been totally disrupted. And until the war is resolved, that won't change.
Ukraine has now exported most of the stocks that were built up during the early months after the invasion. More than half of the grain exported from Ukraine went to developing countries such as Somalia and Ethiopia. This was part of a World Food Programme initiative before the war. What effect has the cessation of the deal really had on dependent developing nations? Let's zoom in on Ethiopia to find out.
Prior to the war, Ukraine shipped wheat to East Africa. They shipped wheat to Southern Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. Those markets are no longer that viable for Ukraine.
Even though grain price has decreased globally, in places like Ethiopia, grain prices have increased with the shift in global food supply chains. Russia has increased production since the war started to compensate for the disruptions to the food supply, and has been supplying the African countries with grain and trying to maintain a stable global market price. However, prices have risen, and experts say this is a direct effect of the Black Sea grain deal being scrapped. Studies have found that the Russian invasion created economic costs of approximately $116.05 billion in the global wheat and corn markets.
Russia's presence in that part of the Black Sea dissipated because of the drone attacks and other sorts of things. So that freed up shipping lanes, and Ukraine's been able to ship wheat. A lot that it came out when it first started. It was just a trickle with a few ships, and I think a lot of people were skeptical. But within a couple of months, shipping levels started to increase. And if we look over the last 3 or 4 months, they've been very, very strong. Again,
a big part of the grain deal is the retention of control over the Black Sea, which is an important battlefield in the war between Ukraine and Russia for a multitude of reasons. Historically, the sea has remained a contentious territory. The Russian and Ottoman empires wrestled for control over the coveted waters 18th and 19th century, since access and control over the Black Sea's ports and shipping routes would grant either side considerable economic advantage. Russia also considers the Black Sea part of its traditional range of influence, with claims spanning from the Russian Empire in the 18th century to the Soviet Union till the end of the 20th century. Control over the sea remains critical for Russia in combating the influence of NATO countries eastward. This is because it is a transit zone between Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The Black Sea acts as a springboard from which Russia can extend its influence in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe. It also allows Russia to retain military presence in places such as Libya and Syria, where there are Russian naval bases. Let's look at some of the key ports in the Black Sea, which are also important for the larger conflict with Ukraine. This is Sevastopol, a strategic major port in Crimea facing the Black Sea. Russia retains control of the port after its annexation of Crimea. This is Odessa, a port city in southern Ukraine. It is subject to frequent attack by the Russian military as a part of its offensive. This is Novorossiysk, a Ukrainian military target and Russia's largest port on the Black Sea, which allows shipments of crude oil to pass through. The Black Sea is an energy hub. The sea is the second largest source of oil and natural gas after the Persian Gulf, marking it a critical energy transfer corridor. Gas reserves in the Black Sea, specifically in the Ukraine shelf, total approximately 2 trillion cubic meters. The Novorossiysk port alone is credited with 1.8 million barrels of oil export, which is 2% of the global supply. Russian exports such as Russian grain, fertilizer, and other goods also pass through Black Sea ports. Russia attacked the Black Sea ports of Odessa and Chornomorsk, where authorities claimed 60,000 tons of grain were destroyed, as well as ports on the River Danube.
Well, I think the real concern initially with the termination of the Black Sea Grain Initiative is that Russia wasn't going to allow any ships into the harbors of Odessa and out, and they still have had bombings and rocket attacks and drone attacks on shipping facilities.
Russian military strategists emphasize exploiting the EU's dependency on its energy sources in the Black Sea by controlling the development of energy projects. Russia has occupied and annexed economic zones in the peninsulas surrounding the Black Sea, which allows Moscow to control access to these areas. As part of this set of actions, Russia aims to maximize its control over the transit of crude oil and gas from the Caspian Sea and Central Asia. Achieving this objective would arm Russia with the ability to either coerce or co-opt individual NATO countries, such as Poland or Bulgaria, by demanding payment for gas in rubles. Bulgaria is one of the countries most vulnerable to such coercion, as it received 90% of its energy supply from Russian provider Gazprom. Russia is able to use this energy dependence to entrap the country in debts and cut supplies if it feels its demands are not met. Additionally, the presence of NATO missile sites, such as the Aegis Shore ballistic missile defense system and the airbase in Romania, motivates Russia to amp up its military influence to combat what it sees as increasing NATO encroachments in the region. This requires the full utilization of its missile, air, and naval forces to extend control over the Black Sea.
Close the sky!
As war rages on various fronts on the Crimean Peninsula, the Black Sea has become a hotbed of confrontation. Control over its waterways represents considerable economic and geostrategic promise.